I'm John Davis, Provost and Undersecretary for Museums, Education, and Research at the Smithsonian Institution, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to the 30th annual Charles C. Eldredge Lecture for the Charles Eldredge Book Prize. Today, we're delighted to be honoring Professor Susan Rather, whose book, The American School, Artists and Status in the Late Colonial and Early National Era, published by Yale University Press, is the winner of the 2018 Eldredge Prize. This prize is awarded annually by the Smithsonian American Art Museum for outstanding scholarship in the field of American art. It seeks to recognize originality and thoroughness of research, excellence of writing, clarity of method, and significance for professional or public audiences. It is meant to honor those authors who deepen and focus debates in the field and who broaden the discipline by reaching beyond traditional boundaries. Before we begin, I'd like to offer special thanks to the American Art Forum, as well as to the panel of the three esteemed scholars who selected the winner of the 2018 prize. The jurors were Jennifer Greenhill, University of Southern California, Janet Headley, Loyola University, Maryland, and Akela Reason, University of Georgia. I'd also like to thank SAM staff members Marie Ladino, Siobhan Jones, Carlos Parada, Willie Prost, and the museum's Research and Scholars Center for facilitating today's lecture, webcast, and for the reception that will follow. Our speaker today, Susan Rather, is a professor of art history at the University of Texas at Austin. She graduated with highest honors from Denison University in Ohio and received her MA and PhD degrees from the University of Delaware. While working on her dissertation, she held a predoctoral fellowship here at SAM. Susan has spent most of her academic career at UT Austin, and during much of that time, in addition to teaching, she held significant administrative appointments as graduate advisor for art history, assistant chair for art history, and associate department chair. Susan's first book, Archaism, Modernism, and the Art of Paul Manship, presented an intellectual history of archaism as a style and technique among early 20th century American sculptors. Manship is a cornerstone of Sam's sculptural collection, and for myself, personally, Susan's work put him on my own intellectual map. The book was a model of close contextual exploration of a fascinating phenomenon. Her sensitivity in dealing with multicultural material, her integration of dance history into her analysis of Manship's work was remarkable. Her early book presented an alternative account of modernism. Before that was a commonplace scholarly project. However, by the 1990s, she turned her attention to the shifting status of artists in British North America during the second half of the 18th century, with research supported by grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Winterthur Museum, the ACLS, the Yale Center for British Art, the Massachusetts Historical Society, and Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art. Susan's particular contribution has been in the 18th century context of artistic professionalism and the self-representation of artists. Turning to seemingly well-known icons such as Matthew Pratt's American School, she takes on old chestnuts and argues for a new set of questions to be addressed to those paintings. She disengages the images from their accreted narratives, examining the 18th century sources with fresh eyes, reorienting interpretation to a maker-centered analysis. This method she deploys to stunning effect in her book, where she looks at such images as Gilbert Stuart's portrait of Sir Joshua Reynolds. Her knowledge of Anglo-American habits of mind and vision during this period is considerable. This is also true of her work on John Singleton Copley and her excavation of his well-known portrait of Paul Revere. She shows herself in this analysis to be a master of 18th century concepts of rank and stature, as well as a surprising diversity of period texts. And I would say that Susan's sensitivity to the evidence of words, her careful attention to the literary 18th century as well as the artistic 18th century, is a distinguishing contribution of the American school. I was lucky enough to read the entirety of Susan's book while it was still in manuscript form. And it was clear to me then, as it is now, how important its publication is. The American School represents the culmination of more than 2 decades of work and demonstrates its author's vast command of the period. Her success in framing the Britishness of earlier American artistic culture may be gauged by the book's publication by the Paul Mellon Center for British Art Studies at Yale, its place on the shortlist for the 2017 William Berger Prize for British Art History, and the fact that in this very same year, the American School received the New England Society Book Award for Art. Please join me in welcoming Susan Rather.
Wow. Thank you so much, John, and it's such a pleasure to see you. It is so great to be here. I'm back in the city where I grew up as the child of 2 Library of Congress librarians. I hardly recognize parts of the city. Some parts have names I never even heard of before, including this neighborhood. I'm really so deeply honored to be among the recipients of the Eldredge Prize, colleagues whom I admire for their probing and creative scholarship. I also know that fellow nominees in 2018 produced exceptional books. So I really appreciate the difficulty for the 3 jurors who had to make a decision, and am grateful to them and to those who nominated me in the first place for this singular recognition. Now, the germ of my project was actually planted at this museum many years ago when, as you heard, I was a pre-doctoral fellow researching early 20th century sculpture. Staff and fellows at SAM and the National Portrait Gallery know these places as places where all kinds of productive conversations unfold. And as it happened, I took part in one on the well-known late colonial painting, The American School. Now, discussion in that moment centered on the persistent unidentifiability of the figures who gather in a space considered to be Benjamin West's London studio. Only West, in green, had ever seemed certain, while 2 others were proposed for the artist, Matthew Pratt, who is known only for this work. The other 3 remaining were a mystery, and still are, as far as I'm concerned. The American School owed its high visibility to West's role as a pioneering history painter, his international profile, and his lifelong mentorship of American artists, among whom the first was Pratt. But that's all hindsight, because in 1765, West was not yet a star, and Pratt not yet a nobody. In that early conversation, I began to play with the idea that the picture wasn't primarily about West, and the interested response by others made me want to run with it. This was still early in my dissertation process, however, so I resisted the temptation, which was quite strong, to decamp to the American 18th century, about which I then knew very little. Almost a decade later, with the sculpture manuscript completed, I readily returned to Pratt's American School. The picture, whatever else one might say about it, struck me as programmatically ambitious. At a time when painters were still largely classed as skilled manual workers or artisans, Pratt projected a different, one might say academic, vision of fine artist, an ideal at odds with colonial British American and even with English realities. Notably, the American School publicly staked its claim in London, where artists' organizations and exhibitions were in their infancy. The 1766 showing by the Society of Artists stood out, furthermore, as the first exhibition ever to feature the work of 3 Anglophone American painters, Pratt, West, and John Singleton Copley. Despite unrest over the Stamp Act and its repeal just before the show opened, independence for any British colonies was still unimaginable, so no one would have understood nascent nationalism in the title, The American School. Understanding Pratt's purposes, as well as considering what the painting represented to his cohort, to London audiences, and later to Americanist art historians, were among my concerns. And these quickly opened out and these quickly opened out to a larger inquiry of what it meant to be an artist, and an American artist in particular, between about 1750 and 1830. I'd like to emphasize that at the outset, I understood the designation American as fluid and variable, but that the scope of my project did not include consideration of all possible Americas. My scholarship has concerned the formation of artistic identities during that time period, and the word identity once held the place of status in my book title. At a late stage, I concluded that identity had become too polemicized and that it set certain expectations, while status more neutrally characterized the nexus of social, economic, and professional relationships that interested me. And at another historical moment, it might have been the other way around. As a historian, I've tried to stay out of the stories I relate, even as I construct them. Today's talk, however, presents a welcome opportunity to speak directly about my process and about the interests and concerns that shaped my project. In conclusion, I'll also briefly address some of the paths I didn't take. It would be difficult to imagine a study of the artist in early America without three accomplished, ambitious, and prolific painters who figure prominently in my book, from left to right, Copley, West, and Gilbert Stuart, with details from some of their notable paintings. With big reputations during their lifetimes, each has been the subject of biographies and exhibitions ever since. I was drawn to this group of established artists by the possibility of deepening existing understandings, free from any pressure to come up with alternative readings if the evidence did not support them. And that's actually the case with Copley, I would say, whose robust colonial correspondence, published as early as 1914, plainly exposed his vexations with being an artist in America, where portraiture dominated all other types of picture making. My starting point with Copley was, in fact, his famous complaint to that effect, unfailingly included in accounts of the artist and sometimes used to characterize the situation of colonial painters generally, as if Copley spoke for all. In this familiar passage, which I won't read, Copley faulted fellow Bostonians for not recognizing him as the practitioner of what he called a noble art, by which he meant a fundamentally intellectual pursuit or fine art. Instead, he claimed, they classed him among persons engaged in useful trades, like carpenters, tailors, and shoemakers. One need not assume that Copley deliberated in singling out these artisans to wonder about their resonance for him. So I investigated particulars of those trades, just as I did the trade of painting, looking for any points of overlap and finding them less in occupational methods than in perceptions of the tradespersons themselves. For example, tailors benefited from the ability to flatter, as did portraitists. Clothing was a prime marker of status, and the premium that portrait clients placed on meticulously represented textiles only deepened the indignity to some painters, because it tethered them to a material world that thinking artists were supposed to transcend. Once I started to look, I found tailors as recurrent antagonists in the writings of 18th century painters who disparaged the obsequiousness of clothing tradesmen against the ideal of the fine artist's independence. If you wanted to insult a portraitist, you called him painter-tailor. This artisanal line of inquiry dictated a hard look at Copley's famous portrait of silversmith Paul Revere, holding a teapot that is finished to the point of engraving. Probably the most widely known early American painting, the work owed its fame less to Copley than to Revere, the ardent revolutionary who would later be immortalized in Longfellow's 1861 poem. But what did that have to do with 1768? I felt the imperative of attending closely to that context, and specifically to Copley's life, after dropping in on a conference of 18th and early 19th century labor historians. It wasn't terribly surprising in that milieu, or at that time, which was really many years ago, to hear Copley's portrait discussed with without reference to, to hear Revere's portrait discussed without reference to Copley. But I was not prepared for general resistance to my suggestion that we consider the painter too, as no less a handworker and maker of luxury goods than Revere. I suspect those historians viewed artists through a more romantic or modernist lens than was appropriate to the 18th century Anglophone context, in effect imagining Copley to have enjoyed more creative freedom and independence than he did. Now, those were conditions that Copley longed for, and he represented their possibility in a contemporaneous self-portrait. Paradoxically, it's a wholly conventional work, right in line with Copley's portraits of the gentlemanly Bostonians who were his primary clientele, persons classed as gentlemen by virtue of their education. Copley had limited schooling, but he thought of himself as an intellectual worker and never showed himself as a working artist. This self-portrait communicates through its conformity, through Copley's representation of himself as a gentleman only a year after he cast Revere as his opposite in that unwittingly revolutionary portrait. With Benjamin West, what drew me was the realization that so little was known about the circumstances of his late life biographical collaboration with John Galt, the author of record for what turned out to be a tremendously influential 1816 book about West's youth in America. West, as we all know, had left the colony of Pennsylvania at age 21 in 1760, acquired the distinction of historical painter to George III in 1772, and had been elected second president of the Royal Academy of Arts, of which he was a founder in 1792. And this self-portrait commemorates that office and West's royal patron, who's present via the sculpted bust. For his British distinction, West merited 5 biographies in British periodicals. None included more than a few sentences about his origins. Here, the red line marks their totality, a passage that concludes, "We have not learned under whom he received the rudiments of his art, nor to whom he was obliged for the direction of his studies." Galt's 1816 story of the boy genius represented a complete pivot filled with colorful and Parson Weemsian anecdotes about West's artistic path, which have inspired children's book authors and illustrators from the 1830s to the 1990s. Writers on West had typically described Galt, who was only half West's age, as a hack writer, implying that he provided whatever others might require. That had the effect of foreclosing on further investigation. What more could one, or would one want to say about such an author? Galt's publications of the 18 teens, and I read them all, do exhibit peculiar diversity, and they are, let's say, quite uneven. But by the early 1820s, Galt had joined, in Coleridge's words, the first rank of contemporary novelists. He secured that reputation with a series of ironic, first-person narratives by provincial characters whose lives the reader pieces together from idiomatic correspondence, reminiscences, and memoirs. To my mind, Galt's collaboration with West on the account of the Pennsylvania painter's formative years begged for consideration in light of the writer's entire output, just as West's fraying late career warranted close examination as the context from which the biographical collaboration emerged. In one stroke, Galt rehabilitated West as an American artist and unwittingly enabled his further diminishment in Britain, a public relations effort of enormous and, I think, unintended consequences for the history of American and arguably also of British art. As my remarks so far indicated, I am just as interested in the close analysis of texts as in close study of images, and curiosity about texts often preceded my attention to visual material. However, in the case of Gilbert Stuart, premier portraitist of the early Republic, a painting came first. Not long after I turned to the 18th century, I received a late invitation to speak at a National Portrait Gallery conference new perspectives on America's old masters. My charge was to focus on a single portrait by Stuart, my choice, but I was given a mere 2 weeks to decide. That was a daunting prospect because at the time I had no perspective on Stuart whatever. Given my new interest in the representation of artists, his 2 early self-portraits, which you've been looking at, seemed like reasonable options, but I worried at the time that I wouldn't be able to say enough about them. An equally early portrayal of Sir Joshua Reynolds, while bland, promised better returns simply because the subject was a famous British artist, the founding president of the Royal Academy, and a man who often portrayed himself. My interpretive approach proceeded from the only period references to the work that I could find. According to one, Reynolds didn't think the portrait looked like him. Since I'd say the face is just like the one we see in Reynolds' own self-portraits, his take is somewhat mystifying. The only other commentary from that time was a critic who thought the portrait was a good likeness, but terribly undignified, not least because Reynolds is about to take a pinch of snuff. My thinking on the work deepened as I began to systematically catalog Stuart's well-known quips about art, patrons, and painters. And I'll say only that I ultimately concluded that Stuart meant on some level to undermine Reynolds, which I believe he did with considerable ingenuity and subtlety. When I returned to Stuart years later with the book in mind, the rich but hazardous record of first, second, and third-hand accounts of his wit and antics became my explicit focus. And this is a case in which we have an artist who left almost nothing in writing. So I couldn't prove that Stuart said or did the things people reported, but I certainly did take them as evidence of fascination with an ungovernable and modern artist type. Stuart seemed bent on undermining the genteel status that a slightly older generation had worked so hard to cultivate, including West, Copley, and Peale, all of whom Stuart knew. As part of my work on Stuart, about whom so many stories were told, I also hunted for any anecdotes of artists in 18th and early 19th century American periodicals in which writing of any kind on art was extremely rare. So not surprisingly, the findings were at best scrappy. A few scattered sentences here and there seemingly unconnected to any other content. Yet their very existence threw up an interpretive challenge that I'd have felt irresponsible to dodge. And I'll just say that this was probably the most difficult part of the entire book, for me at least, to write. And it was also the last. Maybe a connection. On the other hand, I had a field day after stumbling across a curious newspaper series titled The Limner, an old-fashioned term for portrait painter that had nearly faded from use by 1800. Each of the 16 items, appearing over nearly 2 years, took the form of a front-page letter to the editor from a portraitist who at the outset touted his skills and services to potential patrons in the town of Hudson, New York. Painters did advertise in newspapers, but little about the Limner presentation made any sense. And the signatory's name, Peter Pallet, is an obvious pseudonym. The series raised dozens of questions and dared me, much as it would have contemporaneous readers, to solve the puzzle of writings about a portrait maker and clients that don't quite ring true. It didn't take me long to decide that the Limner was an extended political allegory, and figuring it out was pure pleasure from beginning to end. Ultimately, the Limner essays and the mixed bag of anecdotes culled from early mass media prove sufficient for a chapter in itself, one that argues for a surprising degree of public interest in the character and type of the artist, unmoored from the lives of specific artists. So far, with the exception of Pratt, I've spoken only of star artists, but it's impossible to understand them without considering others in their universe. painting as a trade constituted the near and pervasive background against which American and British fine artists sought to distinguish themselves. Artisan painters appear throughout my study, and I'll now give extended attention to one who became the subject of a chapter, William Williams. Art historians had long known of Williams because he appeared, by last name only, in Galt's biography of West as the English-born artist who was West's first teacher in late 1740s Philadelphia. In that account, Williams' role was to recognize natural talent in the 10-year-old and to loan him books of art theory, thereby launching the future history painter and Academy president on his professional path. West's fame set the terms for modern rediscovery of Williams, as evident from a 1937 article titled William Williams, First Instructor of Benjamin West. Over the ensuing few decades, Williams' visibility increased as museums acquired paintings attributed to him, including the self-portrait, which you've been looking at, and this striking trio of full-length portraits presenting the children of Philadelphia printer David Hall, signed and dated 1766. During the same period, a small group of intriguing texts also came to light, and it was they, above all, that allowed scholars to start piecing together Williams' story. Two of the most important documents postdate Williams' death. The first was by Thomas Eagles, an English gentleman who befriended the aged artist in 1780s Bristol, England, and didn't learn of his connection to West until 1805. In this memorandum, Eagles recorded what he learned from West. The second key document of 1810 was a letter to Eagles from West himself, elaborating on memories that were bubbling up from 60 years earlier. Together, these texts present a fascinating web of evidence that comes with a huge caveat. Both embed Williams firmly in the embellished narrative of West's life, so they have to be approached with a special caution if Williams is the researcher's subject. In fact, my initial interest in the memo and letter was in what they might reveal about West, and I came to believe that they provided the stimulus for his consequential collaboration with John Galt. Still, it was impossible not to wonder who Williams was when extricated from West's late life effort to reform his public identity. The known texts by Williams concerning his life as a painter are less obviously colorful. A pair of wills, a petition to be paid for theatrical scenes in Philadelphia, and 3 advertisements. Ads for goods and services constituted roughly half the content of American newspapers by 1760. Now, however formulaic and commonplace as they were, they are an information-rich form of communication, and they offer a great deal to the researcher. So I'm going to spend some time unpacking one of these, with remarks centering on just one of Williams' 3 ads. So I will read this. William Williams, painter, at Rembrandt's Head in Bateau Street, undertakes painting in general, that is, history, portraiture, landscape, sign painting, lettering, gilding, and strewing smalt. Nota bene, he cleans, repairs, and varnishes any old pictures of value and teaches the art of drawing. Those ladies or gentlemen who may be pleased to employ him may depend on care and dispatch. Although the name Bateau doesn't appear on Manhattan maps, I was able to identify it as the common name for Dye Street, which I've marked here with the orange line. Dye ran west from Broadway to the north, or Hudson River, ending at a site where ships were built during the French and Indian War, and this is later precisely the grounds for the World Trade Center. In 1755, the date of this map, and obviously you're looking at a detail, the neighborhood was newly platted, and by 1766, it had an imposing new landmark in St. Paul's Chapel, indicated by the orange circle. Bateau had developed as an attractive tree-lined street where the young Alexander Hamilton enjoyed walking during his time at nearby King's College, and the red dot is where King's College was, of course, later Columbia. Those ecclesiastical and collegiate presences suggest a more refined population than contemporaneous documents indicate. According to a Scottish traveler, more than 500 ladies of pleasure resided in the broader neighborhood, while leases and bonds for Dye Street houses show them inhabited largely by artisans, carpenters, bricklayers, cartmen, a glove cleaner and dyer, a mender of china and ladies' fans, the painter Williams. The houses, if we trust real estate advertisements, were solidly built and well equipped, with brick fronts, cellars, cisterns, kitchens, fireplaces, and in the case of the property Williams rented, a bakehouse and oven, billed as very convenient for a baker. Customers could find Williams by looking for his sign, Rembrandt's Head. Few trade signs remain from 18th century Britain or America, but their appearance can be deduced from illustrated trade cards, advertisements, and other texts, and by reference to surviving tavern and inn signs. An effective sign displayed trade-appropriate images. Goldsmiths might be found at the Golden Cup and Crown or the Teapot and Tankard, while hatters and shoemakers often displayed head and footwear, as on this truly extraordinary survival from a shoe shop in Providence, Rhode Island. What's interesting is that picture makers who were perfectly capable of fashioning their own signboards rarely used them. In part, signs risked reinforcing the historical linkage among the wide range of artisans who used oil paint, including lowly house painters. Within a fine arts cohort, likening someone to a sign painter was possibly the worst way to insult him or her. So here's Joshua Reynolds, the Academy president, who's scoffed that his niece, Theophila Palmer, an amateur painter, this is what he said, might paint signs as did the man who was employed to paint the sign of the Red Lion. He dipped his dog in blood and then dabbed him upon the board and so got the drawing. The point is unambiguous. Sign painting was crude work. Reynolds had a prime target for the slanderous label sign painter in his professional adversary, William Hogarth, a man who started out in the engraving trade, who made and displayed a sign, Van Dyck's Head, at his address, and who often included signs in his affirmatively nativist paintings and engravings, works that challenged Reynolds' continentally aligned vision for the future of British art. In Beer Street, Hogarth imagined the sign painter as well, an emaciated man atop a ladder, holding a palette and gazing in dreamy absorption at his work, as if he were a studio painter at the easel. Instead of mocking the man for unsuitable pretension, Hogarth suggests that he is a stifled talent, the victim of connoisseurs who pay more attention to European old masters, referenced by a book in the basket below, than to modern English artists. Hogarth was popular throughout the colonies, as Williams acknowledged in hoisting the sign of Hogarth's Head above his Philadelphia address in 1763. The fact that he didn't reuse it 5 years later suggests, I think, a targeted strategy for New York, where Rembrandt's Head nodded to lingering Dutch presence, or lingering Dutch heritage. An artist in Manhattan concurrently with Williams commented that houses seemed mostly in Dutch taste, which he captured in this sketch of dwellings with crow-stepped gables. Some visitors estimated the people are mostly Dutch, or that over half were. Now, the facts do not support these impressions. Only a fifth of New York City residents even claimed any Dutch ancestry in 1770, but the perception remained. The head of Rembrandt, then, on Williams' sign, acknowledged the Dutch, but it also, or what he saw as a Dutch present, but it also signaled his awareness of the high regard for that artist in Britain, where a brisk market for Rembrandt's work in all media had been underway since the 1740s. Britons especially admired the Dutch artist's ability to capture likeness. Now, portrait painting was, of course, among Williams' listed services, and yet it's perfectly obvious from his surviving New York examples that he wasn't trying to emulate Rembrandt. He was, however, doing something surprising and markedly English, tapping into the British taste for small-scale group portraits known as conversation pieces. Such works were extremely rare in the colonies. Outdoor conversation pieces afforded artists an opportunity to paint landscape, as Williams did in these examples. As an independent genre, however, landscape painting was almost unknown in 1760s America, so it's striking that Williams had advertised landskip to New Yorkers, pointedly using an Anglophone variant of the Dutch word. Intriguingly, landscape seems to have been deeply rooted in Williams' practice. West told Eagles that when he first met Williams in the streets of late 1740s Philadelphia, his future teacher was carrying a landscape painting, a story made believable by the existence of landscapes among West's very earliest works. Curiously, Williams hadn't even mentioned the genre in his Philadelphia ads, where the term limner, following his name, defined him narrowly as a portrait painter. In New York City, a place with much more diverse tastes, Williams reasonably assumed he could find patrons, and this tiny fantasy landscape is one bit of evidence that he did. It's only about this big. The same hope for a diversified practice accounts for Williams' advertised offer to paint history for New York clients. History painting, meaning, of course, the academic category encompassing religious, historical, mythological, and allegorical subjects, was of limited interest to the English, unless made by celebrated continental painters. But biblical scenes had once been common in the more resolutely Dutch households upriver from Manhattan, so here again I think Williams tailored his pitch to a presumed Dutch-descended clientele. Despite his limited body of works, Williams was rewarded for his enterprise across the American colonies. Eagles, the artist's late life benefactor and beneficiary, had access to a list, now lost, that Williams composed of 241 pictures made over 2 decades in the colonies. That was a substantial output based on what we know of other painters, and it's fully 70% the number produced by the wildly popular Copley during the same period. While there's no doubt that Copley was the superior painter, Williams was clearly much more willing to experiment. With only 3 exceptions, all very early in his career, Copley made portraits, whereas Williams was prepared to branch out and manage to find clients, no small feat. Eagles cherry-picked a few of Williams' New York works for transcription, notably an emblematic composition, 2 New Testament biblical subjects, and 3 types of landscapes, including a moonlight scene and a tempest. For the book, I said what I could about the patrons, with surprisingly full results for Lord and Lady Rosehill, persons whose very existence I had been skeptical about. That inquiry took me on a fascinating detour into early American theater and through Scotland and its courts for a bigamy case against Rosehill, a 20-year-old aristocrat. Not much of that made it into the book, and I did publish an article in a theater journal on this, but I still have in mind to relate the Rosehill saga in some form or another at some point. I'm thinking a movie. In fact, I was casting it about 10 years ago when I stumbled on this, so anyway, I'd have to redo that. So here's Williams' ad again, with highlighting on the words and phrases I have examined or will yet examine. So far, I've talked about Rembrandt's head, Bateau Street, and picture making. Williams further notes, and you can see this here, that he cleans, repairs, and varnishes any old pictures of value and teaches the art of drawing. His customers in these cases were persons with property, disposable income, and leisure time, or in his words, ladies or gentlemen. That was not a loose phrase, and advertisers who meant to cast a wider net addressed potential customers as simply any persons. Williams himself was an any person and made no effort to conceal it. His closing assurance to genteel patrons of care and dispatch was entirely tradesmanlike. Careful and efficient work is still something we hope for from service providers like electricians, plumbers, or roofers, but few over the last 200 years would dream of trying to extract such a promise from an artist. Artists do what they do, and that's what gallerists and collectors want. But as I mentioned with Copley and Stuart, this romantic or modernist understanding of the artist was then in its infancy. Williams plainly characterized himself as a painter, and his line of business as painting in general, the traditional trade name for jobs requiring oil paint. Painting in general encompassed a variety of decorative and utilitarian work, including sign painting. Reinforcing his readiness for that type of work, Williams listed its component skills in his ad: lettering, gilding, and strewing smalt. And smalt was a powdered blue glass made from cobalt, which made signs more glittery and eye-catching, as gilding did as well. All three practices appear on these unattributed tavern signs from Connecticut. As these examples indicate, pictorial abilities mattered a great deal in sign painting. So the fact that Williams at Hogarth and Rembrandt's Heads was also a maker of pictures enhanced his appeal to signboard customers. The same held true of Nathaniel Wales, a portrait and sign painter whose advertisements, like those of Williams, issued the artisanal promise of neatness and dispatch. For a portrait of Captain James Lawrence, on the sign for Bissell's Inn, on the right there, Wales copied an engraving after Stuart, reinfusing it with a degree of painterliness. Observers, not surprisingly, judged portraits on signs by the same criteria they routinely applied to portraits on canvas, that is, by degree of likeness. They also quipped about the failures, as one portraitist did in regard to a Cincinnati tavern sign, and he said, "I'll rub a dog's tail on a pallet, and he'll wag a better likeness." Dogs keep figuring in these anecdotes. Sign painting presented would-be fine artists an opportunity to exercise skills rarely supported by patrons. So this photo, which I took under adverse conditions, shows, and the people here punched it up, so it looks better than I've ever seen it, shows an uncommonly ambitious signboard made by John Johnston of Boston. Johnston grew up in trade, the son of a furniture and heraldic painter, and he apprenticed to the ornamental and sign painter John Gore, who also sold art supplies at the sign of the Painter's Arms. Although by the late 1780s, portraiture had become Johnston's primary business, he nevertheless agreed in 1797 to paint a shop sign for Dr. Thomas Bartlett, whose apothecary had been named as the Boston Dispensary of Medicine for distribution of medicine to the poor. Seizing the opportunity, Johnston based his design on an engraving after Hogarth's 1736 mural of the Good Samaritan for St. Bartholomew's Hospital in London. He was thus able to paint a biblical scene and to see the work placed before the public in advertisement not only of the dispensary, but also of Johnston's ability to paint, or at least to copy, a composition of such complexity. No doubt Williams wanted to showcase his painting skills with each strategically chosen portrait head on his signs, but I think those heads did still more, speaking to art world affiliates across the Atlantic. No fewer than 4 print sellers hung the heads of Rembrandt or Hogarth over their London shops, acknowledging the lively trade in those artists' prints generally, while addressing painters throughout the Atlantic world to whom print sellers extended a professional lifeline. I previously mentioned that signboard imagery was often repeated on trade cards, and so here you see the trade card of John Smith at Hogarth's Head in London with a vignette in the cartouche of Hogarth's sketching, which he adapted from that artist's self-portrait at the margin of his painting in print, The Gate of Calais. And you see I've circled him there with red. Williams collected prints at the very outset of his colonial career in the late 1740s, West told Eagles. To some extent, Williams' needs could have been met by local vendors, colonial American vendors. But once he began assembling portraits of artists, paralleling the interest in artists' lives that West also recalled, Williams would have benefited from expert assistance. Print seller Nathaniel Smith at Rembrandt's Head in London specialized in engraved historical portraits and could have been a supplier since the two men were known to be quite close during the few years that Williams resided in London after making his exodus from New York in 1775 or 6. West, who reconnected with his old teacher at that time, surely exaggerated in saying that Williams spent every day searching for portrait prints of eminent artists. Still, independent evidence of that passion exists in Williams' will, which lists 2 large folio volumes entitled Heads of Illustrious Artisans. Compellingly, they complemented another item listed in the will, a manuscript of artists' lives. Neither of those volumes have survived, at least to my knowledge, so further remarks about them, which I do venture in the book, remain wholly in the realm of speculation. But I don't think it's a stretch to say that Williams' collections of lives and portraits allowed him to conjure an artistic community far richer than his colonial circumstance afforded. Although the historian's dependence on West for key parts of Williams' story cannot be denied, other tantalizing glimpses extracted from the record introduce, I hope you'll agree, a more interesting and enterprising artist than the figure West recalled. On the one hand, Williams exemplified the artisanal practicality and flexibility necessary to survive in a provincial market, advertising, hanging a sign, and taking on a range of painting work. On the other, he cultivated the profile of a fine artist, creating historical and other types of pictures, reading art theory, and conjuring in text and image a professional brotherhood unbound by time or place. The two personae coexisted, disrupting tidy narratives of professional advance or retreat. Williams, in sum, presents the example of an artist who remained flexible about working within the constraints of the existing Anglo-American system while resourcefully nourishing a broader idea of artistic identity. Over the considerable period of time that it took me to write this book, the field changed and new scholarly priorities emerged. While I feel confident in the picture I've drawn of earlier American artists, it goes without saying that the work of any scholar can be expanded. I'd like to conclude by reflecting on a few paths that I chose either not to follow or did not know how to follow, along with others that escaped me. The pressure to be inclusive weighs heavily on the art historian who studies early America. While that world was filled with people who were not white men, the fundamentally public category of artist hardly included any others. Sculptor Patience Wright stands alone as an 18th century woman artist with a public presence, notably in London. She was a portraitist who modeled wax heads, which she's shown doing here, for display atop clothed mannequins, a popular public amusement. From the perspective of those who sought to professionalize, that's 5 strikes against her. Woman, portraitist, wax modeler, popular entertainment, and arguably American. I've noted that the insults male painters lobbed at each other included painter tailor and sign painter. So we can add to that the indignity, if you were a man, of being called womanish. Men who made portraits, especially watercolor miniatures and pastels, were the most susceptible, as those forms and mediums were considered private, mimetic, and suitable for amateurs, ergo, the province of women. In retrospect, I could have given more than passing consideration to the trio of closely related female artists from the Way Champlain family of Connecticut. Mary Way, the best known, made fabric-augmented portrait miniatures, again, a triple whammy from an academic perspective, but a fascinating adaptation to early Republican tastes. What's really notable, though, for me, is that Way was a working artist who advertised her services, sought to support herself from this living, moved to New York in search of better opportunities, and engaged in the fledgling art world there. In other words, she pursued an occupational path very much like that of male artisan painters who worked their way in fits and starts toward a professional identity. Persons of African birth or descent were even less likely to become artists than were women, a constraint of much longer duration in their case for the obvious reasons. Joshua Johnson of Baltimore long held the status of the earliest African American artist, since he left a significant documented body of portraits and a paper trail that includes advertisements. Yet even after Carolyn Weekly's full-blown exhibition and book of 1987, Romare Bearden and Harry Henderson remained hesitant to claim Johnson in their landmark 1992 history of African American artists. We now know for sure that Johnson was of mixed race, manumitted as a young man by his father, and that he became a painter whose profile was consistent with any other artist-artisan. Not least, his patrons were overwhelmingly white, and some evidence suggests that they assumed he was white as well. Not, I suspect, because Johnson made any effort to conceal his race, but because he was an artist, an almost unthinkable occupation for a person of color. Other early African American makers have been more incompletely glimpsed. Moses Williams, enslaved to and then freed by the Peel family, cut silhouette portraits at the Peel Museum, including possibly his own, since the process was mechanized and could be self-operated. Then there's the elusive Scipio Moorhead, for whom no works are known. He was once optimistically believed to have made the portrait of Phyllis Wheatley that survives in the engraved frontispiece to her book of poetry, a landmark of early American literature. But that which was dispatched some years ago by the art historian Gwendolyn Du Bois Shaw in a thoughtful analysis of Wheatley's portrait. As the preceding remarks indicate, even those with deep investment in the history of African American artists have been hard-pressed to recover such artists for early America. The study of any historically marginalized persons requires uncommon resourcefulness and creativity, and chance or luck help enormously. In 2010, this portrait of a Scottish cloth merchant surfaced at a New York City antiques fair and was eventually connected to an enslaved African American artist called Prince Dima. Dima has now been persuasively identified as the subject of a 1773 Boston advertisement that had tantalized historians since the 1930s. And it reads, in part, "Negro man whose extraordinary genius has been assisted by one of the best masters in London, takes faces at the lowest rates." From our perspective, and in a vacuum, the language of this ad might seem demeaning, a sense only reinforced by the now near certainty that the man who owned Dima placed the notice. Yet its terms and assurances were quite unexceptional, normal even, for free white men and women operating at the margin between artisanry and profession. Alas, the rediscovery of Prince Dima, or the knowledge to most of us about this, came too late for my book. The other African American artists I've named enter the story at various points, but tend to do so among a host of other artisan makers, the margin of greatest relevance for those who sought professional status during the late colonial and early national eras. For a book that charts the bumpy process by which painting became a fine art and a profession in the early United States, I absolutely delighted in the irony of finding the strongest image for my book in a humble signboard. And so, if they could weigh in, might American cultural nationalists of the antebellum period. Writing home from Europe in the early 1840s, the veteran engraver and future leading painter Asher Durand admitted to a degree of sensory overload that was by no means uncommon among American travelers abroad. And here's what he said. I can look with admiration and wonder on the beauty and sublimity of the scenes now before me. I can look with gratification and advantage on the great works of art. Yet when all this looking and studying and admiring shall have an end, I am free to confess that I shall enjoy a sight of the signboards in the streets of New York more than all the pictures in Europe. The comment is especially striking because pictorial signboards had by then almost entirely disappeared in favor of the lettered signs that cluttered New York City building facades. Yet in juxtaposition to the pictures of Europe, Durand must have had in mind the homely pictorial signboard. In such apparently simple, direct, and artisan-made images, Durand glimpsed American artistic beginnings as he chose to imagine them, implicitly non-hierarchical and democratic. That was a new ideal of American art and artists, an ideal gradually taking shape in the early United States and subject to ebb and flow ever since. The path to such postures of professional and national pride and acceptance, with all the stuttering steps in between, is the story my book tells. Thank you so much.
So we have a few minutes for questions. If